Patricia locked the doors of her heavy SUV on a remote, freezing Aspen mountain pass. "You need to learn your place," my stepmother sneered through the cracked window, leaving me in a deadly blizzard just days before her daughter's $1 million wedding. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just watched her taillights fade into the whiteout. 3 minutes later, a black armored Land Rover pulled up. My private head of security stepped out, holding a heated cashmere coat. I smiled as I climbed inside. She thought she was burying me in the snow. She was actually burying herself. "Where are you listening from today? And what time is it? Let me know in the comments below." I sank into the heated leather seats of the Land Rover. The ambient warmth quickly chased away the biting Colorado cold. Outside the tinted windows, the storm raged on, completely indifferent to the petty human dramas playing out on the mountain. I brushed some residual snow from the lapel of my coat and took a slow, measured breath. Most people would have been utterly terrified. Most people would have cried, panicked, or frantically called the police after being abandoned on a deadly, icy road by their own family. I just felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. Patricia genuinely believed she had just asserted her ultimate dominance. She thought she was the undisputed queen of the $18,500,000 Aspen estate. She thought I was just a sad, quiet corporate accountant who relied on her father's non-existent charity to survive. She honestly believed my silence over the past 4 years was a sign of total, pathetic submission. She was incredibly wrong. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a premier private financial auditing and investigation firm. We handle forensic accounting and asset recovery for ultra-high net worth individuals across the globe. I do not just track lost money. I completely dismantle fraudulent empires for a living. I see the truths that people desperately try to bury. 4 years ago, Douglas, the man who contributed half my genetics, drove his own commercial real estate portfolio straight into the ground. He owed massive debts to relentless private creditors. He was facing severe federal charges for financial negligence, to honor a sacred promise I made to my late mother. I stepped in from the shadows. I used a corporate entity to quietly purchase the Aspen estate right out of active foreclosure. I paid off his suffocating tax liens. I assumed total control of all remaining assets. Patricia and Madison knew absolutely nothing about the catastrophic bankruptcy. They thought Douglas was still a brilliant titan of industry. They had no idea that every single drop of imported champagne they drank, every custom designer dress they flaunted, and the very heated floors they walked on were funded entirely by my corporate accounts. I let them live their delusional luxury fantasy because it was easier than dealing with their manufactured hysteria. I paid the staggering bills in absolute silence. I absorbed their petty daily insults. I let them treat me like an unwanted stray dog in my own spectacular fortress. But tonight, Patricia had crossed the absolute point of no return. Throwing me out into a deadly winter blizzard was not just another social insult. It was an unforgivable physical threat. Walter kept his eyes on the winding, treacherous road. He drove with the precise, quiet confidence of a man who had survived worse storms than this. He had been my late mother's most trusted groundskeeper. And now, he was my most fiercely protected ally. He knew the absolute truth about the family's financial ruins. A soft chime echoed in the quiet, insulated cabin. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my leather briefcase. The screen illuminated my face with a cold, pale blue glow. It was a high-priority alert from my lead forensic analyst back in our New York headquarters. Madison's lavish wedding was exactly 72 hours away. I opened the secure file. The numbers never lie. Walter navigated the heavy vehicle through the towering iron gates of the Aspen estate. The property was a magnificent testament to old money architecture, built with heavy gray stone and massive oak timbers. The sweeping driveway was already cleared of snow by the private plowing service I paid for every month. We bypassed the grandiose main entrance and parked near the discreet side door. I stepped out into the freezing wind, wrapping my coat tightly around my shoulders, and walked quietly into the house. The interior was a chaotic hive of frantic, expensive energy. The grand foyer, with its towering vaulted ceilings and massive stone fireplace, had been completely overrun by elite event coordinators. Caterers rushed past carrying silver trays of crystal glassware. Florists were precariously balancing on tall ladders, draping thousands of dollars worth of fresh winter cedar, white roses, and imported orchids over the sweeping wooden staircase. It was a spectacular theatrical production of immense wealth. It was entirely fake. I slipped out of my snowy boots and walked silently down the long hallway. None of the busy staff paid any attention to me. To them, I was just the unimportant older sister who lived in the shadows. They had absolutely no idea they were walking on my hardwood floors. As I passed the formal dining room, I heard the shrill, unmistakable voice of Madison. My half-sister was standing in the center of the room, wearing a custom silk-fitting robe, holding a glass of sparkling water. She was surrounded by 3 terrified wedding planners. "This is completely unacceptable," Madison complained loudly, waving a perfectly manicured hand at a floral centerpiece. "I explicitly asked for the rare white orchids from Holland. These look cheap. Hunter has very important business partners flying in from Wall Street. We are a prominent family, and I will not have my wedding look like a discount country club event." I paused near the arched doorway, watching her perform. Madison was 24 years old and completely detached from reality. She had never worked a single day in her life. She genuinely believed her bloodline made her untouchable royalty. Patricia hovered right behind her daughter, beaming with sickeningly sweet pride. She smoothed the delicate fabric of Madison's robe. "Do not let them stress you, sweetheart. Your father is paying top dollar for absolute perfection. We will make sure Hunter's friends see exactly what kind of dynasty he is marrying into." I shifted my gaze to the far corner of the expansive room. Douglas was sitting in a heavy leather armchair, nursing a glass of dark scotch. He looked incredibly tired. His expensive custom suit hung slightly loose on his shrinking frame. When his eyes briefly met mine in the doorway, he immediately looked away, staring intensely at the melting ice cubes in his glass. He knew what Patricia had done on the mountain pass. He knew she had intentionally left me in the freezing storm. And true to his absolute cowardly nature, he chose to say absolutely nothing. He would gladly sacrifice his eldest daughter to the cold rather than face the exhausting wrath of his wife. I did not feel any lingering heartbreak. My empathy for the man had evaporated years ago. I simply turned away from the noise and headed toward the back staircase leading to my private quarters. Their stage was perfectly set. The curtain would fall soon. My private suite was located in the secluded east wing of the estate. It was a stark contrast to the loud, gilded luxury of the rest of the house. The room was minimalist, highly functional, and secretly retrofitted with military-grade security protocols. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and immediately walked over to my polished mahogany desk. I opened my laptop and bypassed the biometric encryption lock. The high-definition screen instantly displayed the secure dashboard of my corporate servers. My elite team in New York worked around the clock, and they had just finished compiling the comprehensive background audit I requested on Hunter. Madison had proudly paraded Hunter around the estate for the past 6 months, boasting continuously about his supposed brilliance as a high-level wealth management director. He wore custom-tailored suits, flashed a massive gold watch, and spoke loudly about offshore accounts and aggressive market yields. He aggressively projected the image of a young, untouchable financial prodigy. My professional instincts had warned me from the very first handshake that he was a complete fraud. I opened the attached financial dossier. The digital pages revealed a devastating, pathetic reality. Hunter was not managing billions. He was a desperate mid-level broker who had made a series of catastrophic, unauthorized trades using his clients' funds. His personal accounts were heavily overdrawn. He was currently facing a massive margin call that he absolutely could not cover. He was essentially standing on financial quicksand, sinking incredibly fast. But the true twist was not his pathetic bankruptcy. It was his incredibly arrogant escape plan. I scrolled down to the highlighted section of the detailed report. My lead analyst had flagged a highly suspicious pending transaction. Hunter had quietly approached a private, unregulated lending firm. He was attempting to secure a massive, high-interest margin loan to secretly cover his toxic debts before the authorities noticed. To secure the loan, he needed substantial collateral. I stared at the scanned digital document on my screen, my eyes narrowing slightly. It was a preliminary loan application. In the section designated for real estate collateral, Hunter had boldly listed the exact address of the $18 million Aspen estate. He was actively attempting to mortgage my house. A cold, dangerous amusement washed over me. For Hunter to even initiate this fraudulent process, he needed a copy of the property deed and a forged signature from the supposed legal owner. He genuinely believed Douglas still owned the spectacular property. He believed he was swindling a wealthy, gullible father-in-law to save his own miserable skin. Someone inside this house had eagerly provided him with those outdated, completely useless documents. Someone was actively helping him drain what they thought was the limitless family wealth. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, interlacing my fingers. Hunter thought he was a brilliant predator sneaking into a very wealthy henhouse. He had absolutely no idea he had just walked blindly into a reinforced steel cage. I did not feel angry. I felt the sharp, thrilling anticipation of a predator watching its prey step directly onto the hidden trap. I closed the laptop smoothly. He was digging his own grave. The soft, rhythmic tapping of sleet against my reinforced window brought my focus back to the present. I stood up and walked over to the thick glass, looking out over the sprawling, snow-covered grounds. Near the edge of the property, barely visible through the swirling white storm, was the small, rustic caretaker's cottage. A single, warm yellow light glowed in the small window. Walter was awake. Looking at that faint light always pulled me backward in time. My childhood in this massive stone fortress had never felt like a comforting fairy tale. After my biological mother passed away, Douglas quickly married Patricia. I went from being a grieving daughter to an inconvenient, unwanted ghost in my own home. Patricia systematically erased my mother's gentle presence from the estate. She replaced the classic antique furniture with loud, modern pieces. She hosted lavish, superficial parties where I was explicitly instructed to stay completely out of sight, deemed too plain and quiet to mingle with her glittering socialite friends. I remembered one specific winter when I was 14. Patricia had arbitrarily decided my bedroom in the main house was needed for her visiting relatives. She abruptly moved my belongings into a drafty, unheated storage room above the old carriage house. The temperature plummeted dangerously that night, and the thin blanket provided absolutely no comfort. I lay there shivering violently, feeling completely abandoned by the world. Then, the heavy wooden door creaked open. It was Walter. He was much younger then, but he possessed the exact same quiet, unbreakable dignity. He did not say a word about the blatant cruelty of the situation. He simply set down a heavy, insulated thermos of hot chicken soup and draped a thick, genuine wool blanket over my trembling shoulders. "Your mother always loved this blanket," Walter had murmured softly, adjusting the heavy edges to block the freezing draft. "She would want you to be warm, Miss Lauren." Walter had been the head groundskeeper since before I was born. He was fiercely, unapologetically loyal to my mother's memory. Over the difficult years, as Patricia's emotional abuse escalated and Douglas retreated further into his pathetic cowardice, Walter became the only reliable source of genuine humanity in my life. He taught me how to prune the delicate winter roses with absolute precision. He showed me how to read the rapidly changing weather patterns in the dangerous mountains. More importantly, he taught me that true strength does not require screaming or demanding attention. It requires deep roots and quiet, unwavering resilience. When I secretly bought the bankrupt estate 4 years ago, my very first executive action was to legally secure Walter's employment contract and completely upgrade his living quarters. Patricia thought he was just a stubborn old servant who stubbornly refused to retire. She had no idea he was effectively bulletproof under my silent, absolute protection. I watched the snow swirl violently around the glowing window of his small cottage. The storm outside was entirely unforgiving, completely indifferent to basic survival. Inside this house, the storm was just beginning. I stepped away from the cold glass. They would pay for everything. People often ask why individuals stay in toxic environments. They wonder why a highly educated, fiercely independent financial investigator would willingly absorb daily insults and act as an unpaid administrative assistant for a family that clearly despised her. It is a very logical question. The answer lies in the deeply insidious nature of psychological manipulation. It does not happen overnight in a sudden explosion of physical violence. It happens in microscopic, almost invisible increments. Patricia was an absolute master of this dark art. She never struck me. She never used graphic language that could be easily recorded and categorized as explicit abuse. Instead, she utilized the quiet, suffocating weapon of normalization. When my mother passed away, Patricia smoothly stepped into the enormous vacuum she left behind. She began by subtly rearranging the house, slowly erasing my mother's distinct aesthetic. Then, she started rewriting the family narrative. Whenever I achieved an academic milestone, Patricia would gently sigh and mention how much money Douglas was spending on my education, completely ignoring my full scholarships. She expertly framed my very existence as a massive financial burden on her new marriage. Douglas, desperate to maintain the pristine illusion of a happy, wealthy family, simply absorbed her narrative. He stopped defending me because agreeing with her was the path of least resistance. Over the passing years, Patricia convinced everyone, including my cowardly father, that I owed them a tremendous debt for simply allowing me to live under their expensive roof. When his commercial real estate empire began collapsing 4 years ago, they naturally expected me to fix the administrative mess. They handed me their tangled ledgers and demanded I balance their chaotic books. They framed it as my fundamental duty to the family name. They genuinely believed they had successfully conditioned me into a state of learned helplessness. They thought I was trapped in their meticulously designed psychological cage, desperately seeking their delayed approval. They assumed my total silence was a permanent symptom of deep emotional defeat. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was actually a highly calculated, strategic observation. I did not stay in this house because I sought their validation. I stayed because I had made a solemn promise to my dying mother to protect her true legacy from their greedy, incompetent hands. I absorbed their daily condescension because it provided me with unrestricted, unparalleled access to their most guarded financial secrets. While they were busy normalizing their subtle emotional abuse, I was quietly normalizing my absolute control over their entire economic reality. I became the invisible architect of their fragile world. I paid the crushing property taxes. I managed the hidden shell companies. I held the undeniable legal deeds to the very ground they walked on. I let them comfortably believe they were the undisputed masters of the grand estate. I let Patricia play the wealthy matriarch and Madison play the spoiled heiress. I encouraged their massive, blinding egos to inflate to dangerous proportions. I weaponized their absolute greed. There was only one specific corner of the sprawling Aspen estate that Patricia had never managed to conquer. It was the small, formal parlor located just off the main library. The room featured dark cherry wood paneling and heavily draped velvet curtains that blocked out the harsh winter light. Hanging directly above the unlit marble fireplace was a magnificent, original oil painting. It was a breathtaking 19th-century landscape, completely out of place among the tacky, ultra-modern art pieces Patricia had aggressively scattered throughout the rest of the massive house. The painting was a documented masterwork. It was formally appraised at exactly $3,500,000. More importantly, it was the only significant physical asset my biological mother had explicitly and legally left entirely to me. Patricia absolutely despised the painting. She hated the dark, brooding colors, and she despised the constant visual reminder of the woman who had occupied this house before her. But beneath her vocal disdain, a rabid, insatiable greed festered. She constantly checked the rising auction prices for similar historical artworks. She knew exactly how much capital was hanging silently on that cherrywood wall. Over the past 4 years, as their hidden financial reality secretly crumbled, Patricia had repeatedly demanded that Douglas force me to sell the piece. She argued passionately that the funds should be reallocated to support the family's desperately struggling lifestyle. She claimed it was entirely selfish for a single woman to hoard such immense, liquid wealth, while her sister required a lavish, high-profile wedding. Douglas, true to his spineless nature, would typically stare at his expensive shoes and mumble vague excuses. He had promised my mother on her deathbed that the painting would always remain mine, but his promises were historically fragile when subjected to Patricia's relentless, shrill pressure. They never actually tried to take it by force because they fundamentally misunderstood the legal boundaries protecting it. I had never bothered to explain to them that the painting was not just a piece of canvas hanging on a nail. Years ago, utilizing my firm's elite legal resources, I had transferred the absolute ownership of the artwork into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. Any unauthorized attempt to move, sell, or alter the painting would instantly trigger a devastating federal grand larceny investigation. The trust was specifically designed to be an absolute, impenetrable fortress. They could stare at the millions hanging on the wall, their mouths watering with desperate greed. But they could never legally touch a single brushstroke. It was a brilliant, silent torture that I deeply enjoyed providing for them. Every time Madison walked past the small parlor, she would glance at the heavy gold frame with undeniable resentment. She viewed the artwork as a massive pile of unspent cash that rightfully belonged in her personal designer wardrobe. Hunter had also noticed it during his frequent visits, his eyes calculating the illicit margin potential of the unregistered asset. I kept the parlor door open intentionally. They could never touch it. The atmosphere in the grand dining room that evening was thick with manufactured celebration and expensive, heavily poured wine. It was the official rehearsal dinner, an intimate gathering designed strictly for Hunter's visiting Wall Street colleagues and Madison's superficial social circle. I sat completely silently at the very far end of the long mahogany table. I wore a simple, unbranded charcoal cashmere sweater. It was incredibly understated, vastly more expensive than anything Patricia owned, but completely lacking the flashy designer logos they practically worshipped. Hunter sat at the head of the table, his face flushed red from multiple glasses of vintage burgundy. He was holding court, loudly lecturing a group of junior brokers about aggressive asset reallocation and high-yield offshore strategies. He used massive, complex financial jargon incorrectly, completely unaware that the only actual financial expert in the room was quietly sipping sparkling water at the opposite end of the table. "It is all about leveraging vulnerable capital," Hunter boasted, leaning back and tapping his heavy gold watch against the crystal glass. "You find an underperforming asset. You strip out the dead weight, and you completely optimize the underlying value. That is how dynasties are built." Madison giggled, leaning heavily against his shoulder. "Hunter is just so brilliant with numbers. He is going to completely restructure my father's portfolio after the honeymoon." I delicately wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, maintaining a perfectly neutral, pleasant expression. When the caterers began clearing the fine china to serve espresso, Patricia stood up. She smoothed the front of her shimmering designer gown and turned her cold, calculating eyes directly toward my end of the long table. The room gradually fell silent, sensing the impending, highly orchestrated drama. "Lauren, darling," Patricia began, her voice dripping with venomous, fake sweetness. "Hunter's senior partners are arriving very early tomorrow morning. They represent immense wealth, and they require the absolute finest accommodations our estate can offer." She paused intentionally, ensuring everyone was listening. "Therefore, you need to clear your personal belongings out of the East Wing suite immediately. We are moving you to the old logging cabin at the edge of the property for the remainder of the weekend. The VIP guests simply must have the primary spaces. I am sure you completely understand the necessity of prioritizing our essential guests." The dining room fell completely dead and silent. The old logging cabin had not been properly insulated or renovated in over 2 decades. It was essentially a frozen, wooden shed used for storing seasonal landscaping equipment. Sending me out there in the middle of a brutal Colorado winter storm was a calculated, profound insult designed to humiliate me publicly in front of Hunter's arrogant friends. Douglas stared intensely at his half-eaten dessert, his face pale, absolutely refusing to intervene. Madison covered a small, malicious smirk with her manicured hand. They fully expected me to finally snap. They desperately wanted me to cry, to beg, or to cause a hysterical scene so they could officially label me the unstable, jealous spinster sister. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I stood up smoothly, pushing my heavy chair back with absolute grace. "Of course, Patricia," I replied, my tone perfectly even and terrifyingly calm. "I will pack my things right now. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone." The bait was perfectly set. The walk across the sprawling, snow-covered grounds was punishingly cold. The wind howled violently through the tall pine trees, whipping sharp crystals of ice directly against my face. I carried only a single, heavy leather duffel bag slung over my right shoulder. I reached the old logging cabin and pushed the swollen, heavy wooden door open. The interior was exactly as deplorable as I remembered. The air was thick with the distinct, musty scent of damp wood, neglected dust, and freezing drafts. A single, bare light bulb flickered weakly overhead, casting long, unsettling shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. There was no central heating, only a small, rusted wood-burning stove in the far corner. It was the exact kind of humiliating, freezing squalor they genuinely believed I deserved. I did not bother attempting to light a fire. I walked directly over to the only sturdy wooden table in the center of the cramped room and unzipped my heavy leather bag. I carefully pulled out a sleek, titanium-cased laptop and a compact, military-grade encrypted routing device. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The machine recognized my unique print instantly, bypassing the complex security firewalls and flooding the dark cabin with a crisp, cool blue light. Within 90 seconds, I had established a direct, untraceable uplink to my corporate servers in New York. The freezing, abandoned shed was no longer a place of punishment. It was a highly sophisticated, invisible command center. I opened the dedicated surveillance application. The screen immediately split into dozens of high-definition video feeds. Years ago, under the guise of upgrading the estate's basic alarm system, I had my private security team discreetly install ultra-covert 4K resolution microcameras throughout the entire property. They were seamlessly integrated into the custom crown molding, the massive crystal chandeliers, and the heavy stone fireplaces. I watched the live feeds with absolute, clinical detachment. In the grand dining room, Hunter and his friends were loudly finishing the last bottles of my imported vintage wine. They were laughing uproariously, completely oblivious to the digital crosshairs resting directly on their foreheads. In the main hallway, Madison was aggressively ordering a tired caterer to completely redesign the floral archway for the third time that evening. I opened a separate window on my monitor, bringing up Hunter's incredibly fraudulent loan application. I cross-referenced his forged signature, attempting to leverage my property against the massive, toxic debts sitting in his personal brokerage accounts. The evidence was absolutely pristine. It was a textbook case of federal wire fraud and attempted grand larceny. Patricia thought she had brilliantly banished me to the miserable cold, effectively removing my annoying presence from her glorious triumph. She had absolutely no idea she had just voluntarily locked herself inside a massive glass box with a highly observant apex predator. I pulled my cashmere coat tighter around my shoulders, feeling the deep, ambient chill of the cabin settling into my bones. The physical cold meant absolutely nothing. I was armed with devastating, undeniable truth. I watched the screens intently. The morning of the wedding eve arrived with a brilliant, blindingly bright sun reflecting off the deep, fresh snow. Inside the freezing cabin, I had not slept a single minute. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair, my eyes systematically scanning the high-definition security feeds flowing across my glowing monitor. The main house was an absolute hurricane of nervous panic and screaming demands. The caterers were desperately trying to navigate the crowded kitchen, and the florists were rushing to replace the wilting white roses. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the tension finally snapped. I watched the feed from the grand foyer. Patricia was storming down the sweeping mahogany staircase, her face flushed an ugly, mottled red. She was carrying a clipboard and screaming wildly at the lead event coordinator about the insufficient temperature control for her imported vintage champagne collection. "We need a dedicated, climate-controlled space immediately," Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the high stone walls. She marched aggressively toward the back corridor leading to the staff quarters. I quickly switched my active monitor to the secondary hallway camera. Walter was standing quietly near his small, private room, holding a simple tray of polished silver cutlery. Patricia did not even pause to breathe. She pointed a rigid, trembling finger directly at the 70-year-old man's face. "You!" she barked, her tone completely devoid of any basic human decency. "Pack your miserable things and get out of this room right now. I need this space cleared and sanitized for the champagne storage. You are officially fired. Take your garbage and wait out by the front gates until the snowplow leaves." Walter did not flinch. He stood perfectly straight, his dignified silence contrasting sharply with her unhinged, manic cruelty. He simply nodded once, placed the silver tray gently on a side table, and turned to gather his modest belongings. Douglas appeared briefly at the end of the hallway. He saw his wife violently throwing an elderly, loyal employee out into the freezing winter morning. He saw the blatant, unforgivable injustice occurring in his own home. He stopped, swallowed hard, and immediately retreated back into the library, shutting the heavy wooden door behind him. That was the exact moment my strategic patience completely vanished. I did not scream. I did not throw anything across the cabin. I simply reached for my encrypted satellite phone and pressed a single speed dial button. "Vaughn!" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Bring the heavy transport to the side gate immediately. We are securing an absolute priority asset." I closed my laptop smoothly, grabbed my heavy winter coat, and walked out into the blinding snow. I intercepted Walter just as he stepped onto the freezing driveway carrying a small, worn canvas bag. Less than a minute later, a massive, black armored SUV slid silently onto the gravel. Vaughn, my elite head of security, stepped out and respectfully opened the heavy heated door for the old man. I instructed Vaughn to transport Walter to the most exclusive 5-star hotel in downtown Aspen, placing him on an unlimited, fully secured corporate account. I watched the black vehicle disappear safely down the mountain road. My tolerance for their existence was completely gone. The final countdown had begun. The freezing interior of the old logging cabin was completely silent, save for the low, steady hum of my encrypted servers. I sat in the darkness, illuminated only by the sharp blue light of 3 high-definition monitors. The snow continued to fall heavily outside, burying the sprawling Aspen estate under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. Inside my digital fortress, I was actively burying Hunter. I opened the comprehensive financial dossier my New York team had meticulously compiled over the last 48 hours. Madison's arrogant fiancé had spent the entire week loudly lecturing everyone about his supposed brilliance as a wealth management director. He aggressively flaunted a heavy gold watch and drove a leased luxury sports car, demanding absolute respect from a family he secretly viewed as an easy mark. I began tracing his actual financial footprint. The reality was incredibly pathetic. Hunter was not a high-level executive managing billions of dollars in elite global assets. He was a desperate, mid-level broker who had been quietly suspended from his firm pending a massive internal investigation. He had engaged in a series of highly aggressive, unauthorized trades using his clients' capital, gambling recklessly on volatile offshore markets. Those markets had recently crashed. I scrolled through his personal bank statements. He was entirely overdrawn across 5 different institutions. He was facing a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar margin call that required immediate liquid cash. If he did not produce the funds by Monday morning, the federal regulatory agencies would officially step in. He was looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary for severe wire fraud and embezzlement. That was exactly why he was so incredibly desperate to marry Madison this weekend. He was essentially a drowning man violently grasping for a golden life preserver. He genuinely believed that Douglas was still a titan of commercial real estate. He believed this $18 million stone mansion was just a fraction of a massive, untapped family fortune. He intended to secure the marriage certificate, seamlessly insert himself into the family trust, and immediately bleed the accounts dry to cover his toxic hidden debts. I accessed the encrypted portal of the private, unregulated lending firm he had recently contacted. Hunter had confidently submitted a preliminary application for a massive bridge loan to temporarily cover his margin call. To secure this desperate, high-interest loan, he had explicitly listed the Aspen estate as his primary collateral. He was attempting to mortgage my private property to save himself from federal prison. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, carefully analyzing the forged signature on the digital application. He had actually managed to acquire a copy of an outdated, useless property deed. Someone inside the main house was actively feeding him the necessary paperwork, completely unaware that the documents they were providing had been legally voided 4 years ago. Hunter thought he was a brilliant shark swimming among clueless guppies. He was aggressively circling a family of absolute frauds, completely unaware that the actual apex predator was sitting quietly in a frozen cabin, monitoring his every single heartbeat. I saved the fraudulent application to my secure evidence folder. He was already utterly bankrupt. People like Patricia and Madison simply cannot comprehend a success they cannot physically wear or loudly display. Their entire worldview is constructed upon visible, easily recognizable luxury. If an item does not feature a prominent designer logo, or if an achievement cannot be aggressively paraded at a country club luncheon, it functionally does not exist in their reality. That fundamental blind spot was my greatest strategic advantage. When I first established my private financial auditing firm years ago, I did not lease a flashy penthouse office in Manhattan or purchase an imported Italian sports car. I wore simple, beautifully tailored neutral clothing. I lived entirely beneath my massive financial means. I intentionally projected an aura of quiet, unremarkable competence. Patricia took one look at my understated wardrobe and immediately categorized me as a pathetic, uninspired corporate drone. She routinely mocked my supposed lack of ambition, while she was frantically spending the family into catastrophic debt to maintain the fragile illusion of high society wealth. I was heavily investing my capital into impenetrable digital infrastructure. I hired the most brilliant, ruthless forensic accountants and former federal investigators. We built a firm that specialized in tracing hidden assets, unraveling complex shell corporations, and dismantling high-level corporate fraud. My clients were ultra-high net worth individuals who required absolute discretion and lethal precision. They did not care about the brand of my shoes. They cared that I could systematically destroy their adversaries with a single, well-documented spreadsheet. I essentially became a ghost who specialized in hunting other ghosts. When Douglas completely bankrupted his commercial real estate portfolio 4 years ago, he was utterly terrified of public humiliation and federal prison. I stepped in seamlessly, utilizing my firm's elite resources to quietly purchase this Aspen estate right out of active foreclosure. I settled his suffocating tax lines through a highly complex anonymous holding company. I did not do it to save his pathetic ego. I did it because my late mother loved this mountain, and I had promised her I would never let her beautiful home fall into the hands of cold, indifferent bankers. Once I legally secured the massive property, I simply allowed them to continue living inside my fortress. I paid the staggering property taxes, the extensive maintenance fees, and the ridiculous catering bills. I let Patricia genuinely believe she was still the undisputed queen of the mountain. I let her dictate the seating arrangements and criticize my quiet demeanor. I absorbed their daily, petty cruelty without a single word of complaint. I never raised my voice to defend my own success. I never showed them my platinum corporate cards or the massive balance of my investment portfolios. They thought my absolute silence was a definitive sign of crushing emotional weakness. They thought they had successfully dominated me through relentless, subtle humiliation. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was actually the heavy, impenetrable armor of a woman who held their entire existence in the palm of her hand. I did not buy expensive designer dresses. I simply bought absolute control. The digital evidence was perfectly arranged across my 3 glowing monitors. I had a complete, undeniable map of Hunter's fraudulent financial architecture. But I needed one final, critical piece of the puzzle to execute the trap flawlessly. I needed to explicitly identify the internal leak. Hunter could not have initiated a multi-million-dollar loan application using the Aspen estate as collateral without physical documentation. Someone in the main house had provided him with the outdated property deed. I accessed the estate's internal Wi-Fi network. 4 years ago, I had personally installed the heavy-duty commercial routers hidden inside the library walls. I controlled the administrative access to every single byte of data that flowed through the massive stone house. It was incredibly simple to isolate the individual traffic from Patricia's personal laptop and Madison's tablet. I initiated a targeted, silent scan of their recent outgoing email attachments. It took exactly 14 minutes for my algorithm to flag the specific transaction. 2 days ago, Patricia had logged into the old, unsecured family desktop computer in Douglas's study. She had bypassed his incredibly weak password and accessed his archived legal files. She had located a scanned PDF of the original, outdated property deed from 5 years ago, the exact document drafted long before I quietly purchased the estate out of active foreclosure. I watched the digital log as Patricia eagerly attached the highly sensitive document to an unencrypted email and sent it directly to Hunter's personal address. She had essentially handed him the keys to the kingdom, completely unaware that the locks had been changed 4 years ago. Patricia was so incredibly desperate to secure a wealthy Wall Street son-in-law that she was willing to secretly hand over her husband's most valuable asset behind his back. She thought she was facilitating a brilliant strategic family alliance. She was actually acting as an active accomplice in a massive federal wire fraud scheme. I leaned back in the freezing cabin, watching my breath plume softly in the cold air. The profound stupidity of their actions was almost difficult to comprehend. They were all so blinded by their insatiable greed and their desperate need to project immense wealth that they never bothered to verify the fundamental legal reality of the ground they were standing on. I opened a secure communication channel to my lead attorney in New York. I quickly attached the pristine digital logs of Patricia's outgoing email, alongside Hunter's fraudulent loan application and his catastrophic personal bank statements. Draft the immediate eviction notices for all non-paying residents. I typed, my fingers moving sharply across the silent keyboard. Prepare the formal grand larceny and wire fraud briefing for the district attorney's office. Ensure the local authorities are placed on standby for tomorrow morning. A small green checkmark appeared on the screen less than a minute later. My legal team was already moving. The pieces were perfectly locked into position. There was absolutely no escape route left for any of them. The steel trap was armed. The heavy antique clock in the grand hallway chimed twice. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The massive Aspen estate was completely dark, enveloped in the silent, freezing grip of the relentless winter storm. Inside the small logging cabin, my high-definition security monitors bathed the small room in a continuous, cold, blue light. I was reviewing the final legal briefings from my New York team when a sharp, red alert suddenly flashed across the primary screen. The sophisticated motion sensors in the small, formal parlor had been triggered. I instantly expanded the specific camera feed. The night vision lens rendered the dark room in crisp, monochromatic gray tones. The heavy oak doors of the parlor slowly pushed open. 2 figures crept silently into the room, moving with the distinct, nervous hesitation of common thieves, trespassing in a high-end gallery. It was Patricia and Madison. Madison was clutching a small, powerful LED flashlight, keeping the beam aimed strictly at the expensive hardwood floor to avoid drawing any attention from the exterior windows. Patricia moved directly toward the unlit marble fireplace. They stopped exactly in front of the magnificent 19th century landscape painting. My mother's $3,500,000 legacy. "Hurry up!" Patricia hissed, her harsh whisper perfectly captured by the sensitive microphones hidden in the crown molding. "The catering company is aggressively threatening to pull their entire staff tomorrow morning if we do not wire the $85,000 final payment. Hunter expects absolute perfection. We cannot let him see that we are struggling with simple vendor invoices." "Are you absolutely sure about this, Mom?" Madison asked, her voice trembling slightly as she swept the flashlight beam across the heavy, ornate gold frame. "Douglas said this painting legally belongs to Lauren. He said she put it in some kind of untouchable legal trust." Patricia let out a quiet, incredibly arrogant scoff. "Your father is a weak, paranoid fool. Lauren is just a glorified secretary. She does not possess the intellect or the resources to create an untouchable trust. It is just a piece of canvas hanging in my house. We are simply liquidating a dormant family asset to secure your future dynasty." Patricia reached into the deep pocket of her expensive cashmere cardigan. She pulled out a sharp, heavy-duty utility knife. I watched in absolute, perfectly still silence as my stepmother stepped closer to the priceless artwork. She did not attempt to carefully remove the heavy frame from the wall. She simply pressed the sharp steel blade directly into the upper corner of the historic canvas. The violent, tearing sound of the blade slicing aggressively through the century-old fabric echoed loudly through my headphones. Patricia methodically cut down the sides, completely destroying the integrity of the masterpiece to extract the center canvas. She pulled the ruined, priceless artwork free, roughly rolling it into a tight cylinder. They thought they were brilliantly solving a temporary cash flow problem. They had absolutely no idea they were actively committing a massive, heavily documented federal crime. They sealed their own fate. The morning sun reflected blindingly off the fresh, undisturbed snow surrounding the estate. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crisp, painfully bright winter sky. I walked slowly from the freezing cabin toward the main house, my tailored navy wool coat contrasting sharply against the endless white landscape. I did not rush. I moved with the calm, deliberate pacing of an executioner. The grand foyer was already buzzing with frantic activity. Florists were making final, desperate adjustments to the towering archways of white winter roses, and caterers were loudly arguing about the placement of the crystal champagne flutes. I completely ignored the chaotic noise and walked directly down the hall toward the small, formal parlor. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. The morning light streamed through the large windows, illuminating the absolute devastation above the marble fireplace. The magnificent, heavy gold frame still hung perfectly straight on the wall, but it was completely empty. Jagged, ruined strips of century-old canvas clung desperately to the inner edges, violently left behind by Patricia's aggressive, careless blade. It was a profound, brutal violation of my mother's memory. I stepped closer, reaching out to gently touch a frayed, ruined thread of the canvas. Most people would have immediately collapsed into hysterical tears. Most people would have run screaming through the hallways, demanding answers and threatening violent retribution. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I felt a deep, perfectly controlled coldness settle permanently into my chest. They had just officially crossed the absolute point of no return. The psychological manipulation and the petty financial draining were over. This was the blatant physical destruction of a documented, multi-million-dollar asset. It was a severe felony, executed flawlessly under the unblinking gaze of my hidden 4K security cameras. I turned away from the empty, ruined frame and walked calmly back out into the bustling hallway. I did not confront Patricia, who was currently barking unreasonable orders at a terrified wedding planner near the sweeping staircase. I simply pulled my encrypted smartphone from my coat pocket. I accessed my secure cloud server and smoothly exported the high-definition night vision footage from the parlor. I permanently locked the file containing the crystal-clear audio of Patricia actively planning the theft and the sharp, violent sound of her knife destroying the canvas. I sent the encrypted package directly to Vaughn and my lead legal counsel in New York. If you ever discovered a family member had maliciously destroyed your most sacred possession, how would you handle the confrontation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I slipped the heavy smartphone back into my pocket. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin in exactly 4 hours. Hunter's elite Wall Street colleagues were currently arriving at the front gates in their rented luxury SUVs. Patricia and Madison were frantically preparing to step onto their glorious manufactured stage. I smoothed the lapel of my coat. The waiting was finally over. I returned to the freezing interior of the logging cabin, shutting the heavy wooden door firmly behind me. The violent destruction of my mother's historic painting was a profound personal insult, but in the realm of high-level financial forensics, emotion is an incredibly dangerous liability. I pushed the anger down, replacing it with the cold, methodical precision of my profession. Patricia and Madison genuinely believed they had brilliantly solved their temporary cash flow crisis. They assumed they had simply pawned an expensive piece of forgotten canvas to cover their extravagant floral invoices. They fundamentally misunderstood the complex legal architecture surrounding that specific artwork. When you steal a physical object, you commit basic theft. When you steal an object formally registered within an irrevocable trust, you immediately trigger a cascading series of devastating federal violations. Years ago, recognizing Patricia's absolute lack of moral boundaries, I had my elite legal team formally transfer the painting into a specialized trust. An irrevocable trust is not merely a piece of paper. It functions as a completely separate, legally protected entity. I explicitly relinquished my direct, personal ownership to the trust, appointing a stringent corporate trustee to oversee the asset. Because the trust held the absolute legal title, Patricia could not legitimately sell the painting. Any broker who accepted it was handling highly documented, stolen property. I sat at my glowing monitors and began running a specialized tracking algorithm. My network swept the local Aspen financial institutions, searching for sudden, large-scale wire transfers matching the estimated black market value of the damaged canvas. It took less than 20 minutes to locate the specific digital anomaly. A local, notoriously unethical art broker had just wired $85,000 directly into Patricia's primary checking account. It was an initial advance for the stolen piece. I watched the digital ledger update in real time. Exactly 5 minutes later, Patricia hastily wired that exact same amount to the premier catering company to prevent them from walking off the estate. She thought she had successfully saved Madison's glorious wedding reception. She had actually just provided me with a flawless, perfectly documented trail of federal wire fraud. By electronically transmitting the illicit funds across state lines to the catering vendor, Patricia had elevated a simple domestic theft into a severe federal felony. The digital receipts were absolutely pristine. The timestamps perfectly aligned with the high-definition security footage of her cutting the canvas. I did not immediately freeze the transaction. I intentionally let the illicit funds clear the bank. I wanted the caterers to arrive. I wanted the expensive champagne to be served. I wanted Patricia and Madison to stand proudly under their incredibly expensive floral archways, completely convinced they had outsmarted me. I wanted them to experience the absolute peak of their manufactured fraudulent triumph. The legal net was now completely invisible, but it was woven from unbreakable titanium wire. I downloaded the official banking logs and attached them securely to the growing dossier on my encrypted server. Every single movement they made was being meticulously recorded, categorized, and weaponized. They were hopelessly entangled. While the digital tracking program finalized the comprehensive wire fraud report, I reached down and unlocked the heavy, fireproof safe hidden beneath my desk. I bypassed the combination dial and pulled out a thick, pristine manila envelope. It contained the ultimate, undeniable truth of the Aspen estate. When Douglas catastrophically crashed his commercial real estate empire 4 years ago, he was completely paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of federal prison. He owed millions in unpaid taxes, and the government was actively preparing to seize every single asset tied to his name, including this magnificent $18 million mountain fortress. Patricia had spent weeks crying hysterically, terrified of losing her social standing and her luxury wardrobe. Douglas had begged me for a temporary loan, assuming my quiet accounting firm was moderately successful. He had absolutely no idea he was asking a highly capitalized private equity CEO for a bailout. I agreed to intervene, but I did not offer a loan. I offered a complete, absolute restructuring. I pulled the crisp, heavy documents from the envelope. The paper felt solid and reassuring in my hands. My late mother's primary estate lawyer, a brilliant man named Arthur, had helped me flawlessly execute the transfer. I established an anonymous holding company, completely shielding my identity from the public records. Through that corporate entity, I paid Douglas's massive tax liens in full. In exchange, Douglas signed a comprehensive, legally binding transfer of deed. He willingly signed away total legal ownership of the Aspen estate, the surrounding acreage, and the valuable independent water rights to my holding company. He did it eagerly, desperate to escape the crushing federal indictments. I stared at the official document resting on my wooden table. The raised red government seal of the state of Colorado caught the cool blue light of my monitors. Douglas did not own a single stone of this magnificent house. Patricia did not own the sweeping mahogany staircase she loved to pose on. Madison did not own the grand ballroom she was currently transforming for her wedding. They were essentially non-paying residential tenants living entirely on my quiet, calculated mercy. My mother had always known Douglas was fundamentally weak. She knew his desperate need to project immense wealth would eventually destroy him. She had quietly ensured that I was highly educated, fiercely independent, and perfectly equipped to catch the broken pieces of his inevitable collapse. Hunter thought he was a brilliant Wall Street predator, secretly applying for a massive margin loan using this estate as his collateral. He had confidently submitted the forged, outdated paperwork Patricia had provided him. He was trying to leverage an asset that belonged exclusively to the quiet woman he had relentlessly mocked at the dinner table. I traced my finger over the raised red seal. The irony was absolutely exquisite. I placed the heavy documents back into the manila envelope and set it carefully beside my laptop. The ultimate weapon was fully loaded, documented, and ready for deployment. The silence was deafening. I initiated a secure, encrypted video conference with my lead attorney in New York. Grace appeared on the screen instantly. She was a formidable, utterly ruthless corporate litigator who despised fraudulent individuals as much as I did. The final packages have been successfully delivered to the local authorities. Lauren, Grace stated, her tone perfectly professional and sharp. The county sheriff has reviewed the 4K security footage of the painting's destruction and the subsequent banking logs. The warrants for grand larceny and federal wire fraud are currently being signed by the duty judge. And the property status? I asked smoothly, keeping my voice incredibly calm. The immediate eviction notices for Patricia, Madison, and Douglas have been formally validated. Grace confirmed, holding up a sleek black folder. Because they engaged in severe, documented felony criminal activity on the premises, their standard residential rights are completely voided. The sheriff's deputies are officially on standby. They are waiting for your signal to approach the main gates. Excellent work, Grace. Keep the team on high alert. I terminated the secure connection and closed my titanium laptop. The extensive preparation phase was officially complete. There was absolutely nothing left to research, nothing left to document, and nothing left to quietly tolerate. If you were holding the undeniable proof to completely dismantle your worst enemies, how long would you wait to reveal it? Tell me your strategy in the comments below. I walked over to the small, narrow closet in the corner of the freezing cabin. I had packed very selectively when Patricia banished me to this shed. I reached past my heavy winter coats and pulled out a meticulously preserved garment bag. I dressed with slow, precise deliberation. I put on a custom-tailored dark navy wool suit. It was a masterpiece of quiet luxury, completely devoid of flashy logos, but radiating an aura of absolute, unbreakable authority. I paired it with simple, elegant pearl earrings and a crisp, white silk blouse. I did not look like a neglected, banished spinster. I looked exactly like the chief executive officer of an elite financial investigation firm. I looked like the undisputed owner of the $18 million estate. I slipped the heavy manila envelope containing the property deed and Hunter's fraudulent loan applications into a sleek black leather portfolio. I placed my encrypted smartphone into my pocket, knowing the high-definition security footage of the midnight theft was safely locked inside. I stepped out of the cabin into the freezing, painfully bright afternoon. The heavy winter boots crunched softly against the packed snow. The main house was vibrating with the faint, muffled sounds of classical string music. The prestigious guests had already arrived. The ceremony was minutes away from beginning. I walked slowly across the pristine, white lawn toward the grand entrance. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety. My heart rate was perfectly steady. The countdown reached 0. The grand ballroom of the Aspen estate had been completely transformed into a breathtaking winter wonderland. The vaulted stone ceilings were draped with thousands of delicate white orchids and heavy garlands of fresh green cedar. Soft, warm light radiated from dozens of crystal chandeliers, casting a magical, romantic glow over the assembled crowd. Over 200 guests filled the elegant, velvet-lined chairs. They were a curated collection of Wall Street executives, prominent local socialites, and wealthy business partners Hunter desperately needed to impress. They murmured softly to one another, admiring the spectacular display of supposed generational wealth. I entered the ballroom through the heavy oak double doors at the very back. I moved silently, blending into the shadows near the towering floral archways. My dark navy wool suit was a stark contrast to the sea of colorful, flashy designer gowns worn by Patricia's friends. At the front of the room, standing beneath an elaborate canopy of white winter roses, was Hunter. He wore a custom, razor-sharp tuxedo, his posture radiating immense, arrogant pride. He checked his heavy gold watch, offering a smug, confident smile to his senior partners sitting in the front row. He genuinely believed he had successfully secured his financial salvation. The string quartet smoothly transitioned into a traditional, soaring bridal march. The massive doors opened again, and Madison stepped into the center aisle. She looked undeniably beautiful, wrapped in layers of imported, voluminous white silk. But my eyes immediately locked onto her collarbone. Resting heavily against her skin was a brand-new, spectacular diamond necklace. The stones caught the light of the chandeliers, throwing brilliant, expensive shards of color across the room. It was the physical manifestation of my mother's destroyed painting. Patricia walked slightly behind her, practically vibrating with triumphant, manic joy. She smiled broadly at the wealthy crowd, her chest puffed out with absolute pride. She had successfully navigated the catastrophic financial crisis. She had secured the Wall Street son-in-law. She had maintained her glorious illusion of ultimate power. Douglas stood nervously near the altar, his face pale and slick with a thin layer of cold sweat. He looked like a man who knew the ice beneath his feet was cracking, but was absolutely terrified to move. I watched Madison glide slowly down the long, white carpet toward her fraudulent prince. They were the perfect, incredibly toxic match. A desperate, broke financial grifter marrying a spoiled, delusional woman who had eagerly committed a federal felony to fund her own floral arrangements. The officiant, a distinguished local judge, smiled warmly as Madison finally reached the altar. He raised his hands, signaling the wealthy crowd to take their seats. The ballroom settled into a reverent, hushed silence. "We are gathered here today," the judge began, his deep voice projecting clearly across the massive room. I stepped out from the shadows. The illusion ended now. I walked with a steady, rhythmic pace straight down the center of the long, white carpet. My tailored navy wool suit cut a sharp, authoritative line through the sea of pastel gowns and soft floral arrangements. I did not rush. I carried the sleek black leather portfolio smoothly at my side. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The sudden, absolute silence in the grand ballroom was incredibly heavy. Heads turned rapidly as I bypassed the back rows of seated guests. Whispers broke out among Hunter's Wall Street colleagues. They recognized the distinct, unapologetic posture of someone who owned the room. Patricia, standing in the front row, noticed the sudden commotion and turned around. The triumphant, manic smile instantly vanished from her face. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. "What are you doing?" Patricia hissed, aggressively stepping into the center aisle to physically block my path. Her voice was a desperate, sharp whisper, terrified of causing a scene in front of the elite crowd. "I explicitly told you to stay out of sight. Go back to the cabin immediately. You are ruining the aesthetic." I did not stop walking. I simply stepped around her as if she were an inconvenient piece of furniture. Madison gasped from the altar, her hands flying defensively to her chest, clutching the brand-new diamond necklace. Hunter's smug, arrogant grin melted into a deep, furious scowl. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest, attempting to project the dominant, protective alpha male persona he so desperately clung to. "Listen to me very carefully. Lauren," Hunter barked, his voice loud enough to echo across the silent, stunned ballroom. "You are completely unhinged. If you do not turn around and walk out those doors right now, I will have my security physically remove you. You will not ruin this family's day with your pathetic jealousy." I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his aggressive volume. "I am not here because I am jealous. Hunter," I said, my voice projecting a cool, terrifying calm that instantly chilled the entire room. "I am here because it is my fundamental legal duty to inform you that this wedding cannot proceed." "Excuse me," the judge asked, looking completely bewildered. I kept my eyes locked directly onto Hunter's furious face. "You cannot marry this woman, Hunter. You are attempting to marry into a prominent, wealthy family to quietly cover the catastrophic margin call currently sitting in your overdrawn brokerage accounts. But you have made a massive, critical miscalculation." Hunter physically stumbled backward, his face instantly draining of all color. The wealthy partners in the front row gasped loudly, exchanging shocked, alarmed glances. The mention of a margin call in this specific crowd was absolute, undeniable professional poison. "What did you just say?" Hunter stammered, his confident Wall Street persona completely disintegrating before my eyes. "I said," I replied evenly, my voice sharp and lethal. "You are attempting to marry a family of destitute, criminal frauds." The ballroom erupted. The initial shockwave of my statement rippled through the elegant crowd of Wall Street executives and prominent socialites. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was broken only by the soft, confused murmurs of Hunter's senior partners sitting in the front row. A devastating accusation of financial insolvency was the absolute worst thing you could possibly say in front of a group of ruthless, hyper-competitive investment bankers. Hunter physically recovered from his initial shock, his face flushing with a deep, defensive anger. He let out a loud, incredibly forced laugh, turning toward his wealthy colleagues to project an image of confident amusement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate interruption," Hunter announced, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "This is Madison's estranged, deeply unstable older sister. She has a tragic history of mental health struggles and pathological jealousy. Please, just ignore her desperate cries for attention." Patricia immediately stepped forward, eager to support his entirely fabricated narrative. "Lauren, you are completely out of your mind, Douglas. Call the private security team immediately. Have this deranged woman physically removed from my magnificent home before she completely ruins her sister's magical day." Douglas remained absolutely frozen near the floral altar, his face the color of wet ash. He did not move a single muscle to call for security, because he fundamentally knew who actually paid their salaries. I did not argue with their pathetic lies. I did not raise my voice to defend my own sanity. I simply lifted the sleek, black leather portfolio I was carrying and unzipped the main compartment. The sharp metallic sound of the heavy zipper seemed to echo loudly across the silent room. I pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of certified financial documents. "You pride yourself on aggressive asset management, Hunter," I stated, my voice projecting a perfectly even, icy calm. "So, I highly suggest you examine the underlying fundamentals of your latest acquisition. You are attempting to leverage this $18 million estate to cover your catastrophic, multi-million-dollar margin call. But you cannot leverage an asset that your future father-in-law does not actually own." I stepped forward and gently tossed the heavy stack of documents directly onto the small marble table next to the floral altar. Hunter hesitated for a fraction of a second. His massive ego demanded that he ignore the paperwork entirely. But his desperate, sinking financial reality forced his hand. He aggressively snatched the documents from the table, intending to loudly mock whatever fake printouts he assumed I had manufactured. The moment his eyes scanned the first page, his arrogant smirk completely vanished. He was staring directly at a certified federal bankruptcy filing from 4 years ago. It explicitly detailed the absolute collapse of Douglas's commercial real estate portfolio, listing over $12 million in defaulted loans and severe federal tax liens. Hunter frantically flipped to the next page. It was a formal, notarized deed of trust bearing the raised red seal of the state of Colorado. The document explicitly proved that the entire Aspen estate, including the surrounding acreage and independent water rights, had been legally transferred to an anonymous holding company. "Look at the final page." "Hunter," I instructed softly, watching his breathing become incredibly shallow. "Look at the certified K-1 tax schedules and the corporate registry. Douglas possesses exactly zero equity in this property. Patricia owns absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. You are attempting to marry into a family that has been surviving entirely on my quiet, calculated charity for 48 months. Hunter's hands began to tremble violently. He was a professional numbers man, and the devastating math was finally computing in his brain. The silence was absolute. Hunter stood completely paralyzed at the magnificent floral altar, his eyes glued to the devastating financial documents in his trembling hands. The crisp, certified pages represented the absolute destruction of his desperate escape plan. There was no hidden family fortune. There was no valuable real estate collateral to save him from his catastrophic margin call. He had bet his entire freedom on a spectacular, hollow illusion. "Hunter, what is it?" Madison whispered, taking a hesitant step toward him. Her heavy silk wedding gown rustled softly in the quiet room. "What do those papers say? Tell them she is lying. Tell them my father is a wealthy man." Hunter slowly lowered the documents. He did not look at me. He turned his head and stared directly at Patricia and Madison with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The sophisticated Wall Street facade he had carefully maintained for months completely shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered grifter underneath. "You completely lied to me," Hunter hissed, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, barely contained fury. He aggressively shoved the certified bankruptcy filings directly into Patricia's chest. "You told me this estate was an untethered family asset. You told me Douglas was expecting a massive commercial payout next quarter. You are a family of broke, pathetic squatters." Patricia stumbled backward, clutching the papers, her face drained of all remaining color. "No, Hunter, please. You have to understand." She pleaded frantically, her manufactured elegance dissolving into pure desperation. "It is just a temporary liquidity issue. Douglas is restructuring. We still have the prominent social connections. We still have the family pedigree." "Pedigree," Hunter barked, letting out a harsh, incredibly cruel laugh. "You cannot pay a federal margin call with social connections." "Patricia, you literally tried to mortgage a house you do not even own. Do you have any idea what kind of federal wire fraud charges you just dragged me into?" His eyes darted to Madison, zeroing in on the spectacular diamond necklace resting heavily against her collarbone. And that necklace," Hunter continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold whisper. He pointed a rigid finger at the stolen diamonds. "Where exactly did you get that capital? Your mother was begging me for a honeymoon upgrade just last week because she could not afford the flights." Madison burst into frantic, hysterical tears. "It is a family heirloom. Mom said it was mine. It is stolen property," I clarified smoothly, my voice cutting easily through the chaotic panic. "They broke into my secure suite at 2 o'clock this morning and used a utility knife to destroy a highly documented $3 million historical painting to acquire those stones. It is an active grand larceny investigation, Hunter. And you are standing at the altar with the primary suspect." Hunter physically recoiled from Madison as if her expensive silk dress was suddenly covered in a highly infectious disease. The senior partners in the front row simultaneously stood up, deliberately stepping backward toward the exit. In their elite financial world, association with blatant, documented criminal fraud was absolute professional suicide. Hunter aggressively ripped the delicate white winter rose boutonniere from his custom tuxedo lapel. He threw the crushed flower violently onto the white carpet at Madison's feet. "The wedding is permanently canceled," Hunter announced, addressing the stunned crowd before glaring one last time at the weeping bride. "I am leaving. Do not ever contact me again." He turned on his heel and marched rapidly down the aisle, desperate to distance himself from the toxic, burning wreckage. The fairy tale was dead. Hunter had barely taken 5 steps down the white carpet when a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out from the second row of guests. It was Marcus, Hunter's retained private counsel. He was a notoriously aggressive defense attorney known for utilizing dirty, manipulative legal loopholes to protect his wealthy clients from accountability. Marcus held up his hand, signaling Hunter to stop, before turning his aggressive, calculating gaze directly toward me. "Not so fast, Ms. Lauren," Marcus announced, projecting a loud, theatrical confidence designed to immediately reclaim control of the chaotic narrative. "My client is not walking away in disgrace based on a few printed spreadsheets. I have dealt with hostile family takeovers before, and I recognize exactly what this is." He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket and snapped it open. "I am officially requesting an immediate emergency injunction from the local magistrate," Marcus declared proudly. "You claim you acquired this property from your father 4 years ago to clear his debts. However, it is abundantly clear to everyone in this room that Douglas has been suffering from severe cognitive decline and intense psychological pressure. I am officially accusing you of elder abuse and predatory coercion." Patricia gasped, her eyes lighting up with a sudden, manic surge of renewed hope. She grabbed Douglas's arm, practically digging her nails into his expensive suit jacket. "Yes, that is exactly what happened. She manipulated him when he was confused. The transfer is completely invalid. We still own the house." Marcus smiled smugly, believing he had brilliantly checkmated my entire operation. A contract signed under severe duress by a mentally compromised individual is completely void under federal law. The property remains in Douglas's possession, which means Hunter's collateral assessment is legally defensible. I am calling the authorities right now to have you arrested for coercive fraud. The ballroom held its collective breath. They expected me to panic. They expected my quiet confidence to finally shatter under the heavy weight of a formal legal threat. I did not even blink. I gently tapped the discreet communication device hidden in my ear. "Vaughn, execute Protocol Delta on the primary screens." Behind the floral altar, the massive, high-definition projection screen originally intended to display a romantic slideshow of Madison and Hunter's relationship suddenly descended from the vaulted ceiling. The expensive string lighting dimmed automatically. A crystal-clear, 4K video began to play. It was a recording from 4 years ago, captured inside a sterile, highly illuminated legal boardroom. Douglas sat at a heavy conference table, looking completely healthy, sharp, and entirely coherent. Sitting directly next to him was a prominent federal notary public. Sitting across from him was a highly respected, board-certified forensic psychiatrist. "Douglas," the psychiatrist asked clearly on the video, "are you fully aware of the documents you are signing today, and are you doing so without any internal or external coercion?" "I am fully aware," Douglas replied on screen, his voice steady and desperate. "I am signing this property over to Lauren's holding company voluntarily to avoid federal tax prosecution. It is my only choice." I turned my calm, unbothered gaze back to the aggressive defense attorney. Marcus stared at the undeniable, legally bulletproof video playing on the massive screen. His smug expression completely evaporated. He was a professional lawyer, and he instantly recognized that continuing to push a blatantly false narrative against perfectly documented evidence would result in his immediate disbarment and severe perjury charges. Marcus slowly folded his useless injunction, turned his back on Hunter, and walked swiftly out the back doors without saying another word. The final trap snapped shut. The rapid, humiliating departure of Hunter's defense attorney effectively shattered the very last illusion of hope in the grand ballroom. The remaining guests, composed entirely of superficial socialites and nervous business partners, began quietly and efficiently exiting the room. Nobody wanted to be officially documented as a witness to a massive federal fraud investigation. Within 10 minutes, the spectacular flower-draped space was completely empty, save for my shattered family. The heavy oak double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open one final time. 3 uniformed deputies from the local sheriff's department stepped into the room, their boots leaving wet tracks on the pristine white carpet. They moved with the swift, purposeful energy of law enforcement responding to a highly documented, severe felony. I walked calmly toward the lead deputy and handed him the sleek black portfolio. "Officer," I said smoothly, my voice echoing in the vast, empty room. "Inside this folder are the formal, court-approved eviction notices for Patricia, Madison, and Douglas. Their residential rights have been immediately terminated due to their active engagement in grand larceny on the premises. I have already provided your department with the 4K security footage of the destruction of the artwork." The deputy nodded respectfully, reviewing the raised seals on the documents. He turned his stern gaze toward the 3 figures huddled near the altar. "You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your basic, essential clothing and vacate the premises," the deputy instructed, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You will surrender the stolen diamond necklace immediately. You will not take any jewelry, art, or luxury items purchased with the corporate funds. If you resist, you will be escorted out in handcuffs." Madison let out a loud, pathetic wail, desperately trying to unfasten the heavy platinum clasp of the stolen diamonds. Her fingers trembled so violently she could barely manage the delicate mechanism. Patricia stood completely frozen, her eyes wide and blank, her mind utterly unable to process the absolute, terrifying reality of her sudden poverty. Douglas finally found the courage to move. He stumbled forward, his expensive dress shoes tangling in the edges of the white carpet. He fell to his knees directly in front of me, his face slick with tears of profound regret and absolute terror. "Lauren, please," Douglas sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand toward the hem of my tailored navy suit. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was weak. I was a terrible father. Please, do not throw me out into the winter storm. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. I am your blood." I looked down at the broken, pathetic man kneeling on the floor. I felt a complete, absolute emptiness where a daughter's love should have resided. "You chose them, Douglas," I stated quietly, my voice devoid of any anger or sympathy. "When they banished me to a freezing cabin, you stayed silent. When they destroyed my mother's legacy to fund their toxic illusions, you stayed silent. You sacrificed me to protect your fragile ego. Now, you get to share their exact fate." I smoothly stepped backward, easily avoiding his desperate grasp. "Take them out," I instructed the deputies. I watched flawlessly as they were escorted out the front doors into the relentless, freezing Colorado blizzard, clutching cheap canvas bags. They had absolutely nothing left. The mountain was mine again. 6 months later, the brutal, suffocating winter storms finally released their grip on the Colorado mountains. The heavy layers of thick ice slowly melted away, revealing the vibrant, resilient green landscape beneath. The air was crisp, carrying the fresh, clean scent of blooming alpine wildflowers and wet pine needles. The sprawling Aspen estate had undergone a profound, spectacular transformation. I stood on the massive stone balcony overlooking the pristine grounds. I was wearing a simple, elegant beige cashmere sweater and comfortable trousers, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. The dark, oppressive energy that Patricia and Madison had aggressively pumped into the walls of this house was completely, permanently gone. The grand ballroom, which had previously served as the theatrical stage for their fraudulent, disastrous wedding, had been entirely repurposed. The tacky, heavy velvet curtains and the excessive crystal chandeliers had been removed. The space was now flooded with natural, brilliant sunlight. I had officially transformed the vast wing of the estate into an elite, highly secure retreat and consulting center for female entrepreneurs. Specifically, we provided intensive financial literacy training, legal support, and capital restructuring for women who were actively trying to escape financially abusive relationships and toxic corporate partnerships. It was no longer a monument to empty, pathetic vanity. It was a thriving, powerful fortress of absolute independence. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the activity on the lower lawns. Several prominent female CEOs were walking along the paved stone paths, engaged in deep, strategic conversations. They were brilliant, capable women who did not need to project an illusion of wealth, because they possessed the intelligence and the relentless drive to actually generate it. Near the edge of the beautifully manicured rose garden, I spotted a familiar, comforting figure. Walter was carefully pruning a line of vibrant, blooming bush roses. He moved a little slower now, but his posture was incredibly straight and proud. He was no longer treated like a disposable, invisible servant. He was formally recognized as the estate's chief estate manager, supported by a comprehensive platinum-tier corporate healthcare package and a fully funded, irrevocable retirement trust. He looked up and caught my eye, offering a small, incredibly warm smile and a polite nod before returning to his meticulous work. I smiled back, protecting Walter, ensuring his absolute security and dignity in his final years, brought me vastly more satisfaction than the financial destruction of my enemies ever could. Revenge is a cold, incredibly effective tool for clearing away the rot. But revenge itself cannot sustain a meaningful life. Once you have systematically burned the toxic elements to the ground, you have an absolute obligation to build something beautiful and enduring in the ashes. I breathed in the clean, mountain air. The constant, exhausting hum of anxiety that had plagued my entire childhood was finally silenced. The ghosts of the past had been legally, permanently evicted. I finally felt truly home. I sat at my polished mahogany desk in the newly renovated east wing of the estate. The heavy velvet curtains were completely drawn back, letting the brilliant morning sunlight flood the workspace. My encrypted laptop displayed a final, comprehensive legal brief from Grace, my lead attorney in New York. The fallout from the disastrous, ruined wedding had been incredibly swift and absolutely devastating for those involved. Hunter's fraudulent house of cards had collapsed exactly as my financial models predicted. When the federal regulators formally audited his heavily overdrawn brokerage accounts, they immediately found the forged loan applications and the massive, unrecoverable margin deficits. My team had meticulously tracked every single illicit wire transfer, flawlessly cross-referencing the bank timestamps with the high-definition security footage. It was a textbook execution of forensic accounting. There was no cinematic magic, no dramatic courtroom shouting matches, just the cold, undeniable weight of verified banking records. He was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting inevitable sentencing for severe wire fraud. His elite Wall Street career was completely, permanently erased. Patricia and Madison had retreated to a cramped, heavily mortgaged apartment in a remarkably unremarkable suburb of Denver. Without unlimited access to my corporate platinum cards, they were violently forced to confront the crushing reality of actual, working-class life. Madison was reportedly working a minimum-wage shift at a discount retail store, surrounded by the exact cheap clothing she used to mercilessly mock. Patricia had completely lost her glittering social circle. In the world of high finance, poverty is a highly contagious disease, and no one wanted to catch it. I did not feel any lingering vindictiveness as I read the detailed report. There was no triumphant cheering or petty gloating. I simply felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. The universe had accurately, mathematically corrected itself. At the very bottom of my daily mail stack, Walter had placed a single, handwritten envelope. The return address was a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of the county. It was from Douglas. I picked up the thin envelope. I knew exactly what it contained. It would be a pathetic, rambling letter filled with empty apologies and desperate pleas for financial forgiveness. He would attempt to invoke the sacred, emotional bond of family, conveniently forgetting that he had repeatedly sacrificed that exact bond to protect his fragile, manufactured ego. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it is not a mandatory requirement for personal healing. Sometimes, the most incredibly healthy decision you can make is to permanently amputate the diseased limb to save the rest of the body. Douglas had actively chosen his path of cowardly silence for years. He had permitted the emotional abuse. He had allowed the violent theft of my mother's legacy. I did not open the envelope. I did not need to read his desperate excuses. My healing did not require his delayed validation. I simply dropped the unopened letter directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder beside my desk. The machine whirred quietly, turning his pathetic apologies into meaningless strips of white confetti. I closed the legal brief and turned my attention to the incoming applications for our new female entrepreneur grant program. The past was finally, completely dead. The future was waiting. The afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting long, elegant shadows across the pristine grounds. I walked out of my office and moved quietly down the main hallway. The house was peaceful, filled with the soft, productive murmurs of the brilliant women who now utilize the estate as a sanctuary for corporate restructuring and financial independence. I paused in front of the small, formal parlor. The heavy oak doors were wide open. Hanging directly above the marble fireplace was my mother's 19th-century landscape painting. It had taken an elite team of specialized art restorers 3 months of painstaking microscopic work to perfectly repair the violent damage Patricia had inflicted. The jagged cuts were now completely invisible to the naked eye. The masterpiece had been fully restored to its original, breathtaking glory. I looked at the rich, brooding colors and felt a profound, enduring connection to the woman who had left it to me. My mother had understood the fundamental truth about power and wealth long before I ever did. She knew that true value is never loudly announced or aggressively flaunted. It is quietly maintained, meticulously protected, and strategically deployed only when absolutely necessary. For years, I had allowed a family of shallow, parasitic grifters to explicitly mistake my strategic silence for pathetic weakness. I had let them project their massive, glaring insecurities onto me, absorbing their daily insults while I silently paid for the very roof over their heads. They had aggressively built a towering, glittering castle entirely on a foundation of my hidden capital. There is a popular misconception that true justice requires a cinematic, explosive confrontation. People expect dramatic speeches, shattered glass, and tearful apologies. The reality of high-level financial justice is vastly different. It is the slow, inevitable grinding of bureaucratic gears. It is the undeniable mathematics of a ruined credit score, a voided contract, and verified tax schedules. It is the quiet, final thud of a judge's gavel sealing a certified bankruptcy. They fundamentally believed that screaming the loudest made them the absolute rulers of the room. They failed to realize that the person quietly holding the actual deed to the room does not ever need to raise her voice. I had not engaged in petty screaming matches. I had not resorted to physical violence or vindictive vandalism. I had simply stepped back and allowed their own insatiable, toxic greed to completely consume them. I had built a flawless, undeniable paper trail, weaponized the fundamental laws of high finance, and executed a legally perfect eviction. The magnificent Aspen estate was no longer a gilded cage of emotional abuse and financial fraud. It was a powerful, enduring testament to resilience, forensic accuracy, and the absolute triumph of calculated intelligence over loud, desperate vanity. Power is not a designer label. Legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you relentlessly protect. I turned away from the beautiful painting and walked toward the grand dining room to join my colleagues. The air was warm, and the future was entirely my own. I never looked back.